Suspense is a crucial element in so many forms of storytelling. From literature to film to television, it's how you keep your readers or watchers glued to the page. But as a writer, building that suspense can be a challenging task. That's why I'm here with 4 ways that you can build suspense seamlessly and easily into your story. So let's get started. Sup peoples, and welcome back to another video. Let's jump right into it before I bore you with a bunch of other stuff. Because suspense is super important. And you know what is not suspenseful? Me telling you to like, comment, subscribe, all things you should do, but they're just not very suspenseful. So instead of talking about all of that boring stuff, we're just gonna jump right into tip number 1, cliffhangers. Now, cliffhangers are an excellent way to keep your readers or watchers engaged. If you don't live under a rock, you probably have seen these in media before. From the dramatic last scene of a chapter, or the agonizing way that your favorite show left off on the last episode. Well, you know what? Bad Batch came out very recently, and I'm just like, why do the couldn't the episodes be longer? You know, the moment it comes out, I have to watch it. And it's exactly the feeling you want your readers or watchers to have. You want them to see the installment of your story, and then the moment it's over, go online, talk about it with a bunch of strangers on a forum, and then wait with their eyes glued to the screen until the next episode drops, or the next issue of your comic comes out. Or if you're writing a novel, then they can just turn the next page, which is a lot more convenient, but you still want them to have that feeling. Now, I'm currently writing a monthly comic called Project Punk. I'm working on trying to get it published, and I will link the playlist up above if you're interested in seeing that process. But part of writing that is the use of cliffhangers, because the way that a monthly comic works out is it comes out monthly. Maybe I didn't need to explain that, but I did it anyway. Each issue is about 20 to 22 pages, and if you want the reader to go back and buy the next issue, you really have to hook them with the first one. And you have to keep that up, because it's not something that will just pop up into their feed or something along those lines. They have to actively go and buy each issue every single month. So cliffhangers are super vital, and I've discovered that I really like them. When it comes to cliffhangers, I try and have a cliffhanger that makes sense for the scene or story that I'm telling. And I also try and think about where I should have the big cliffhangers and where I should have a smaller cliffhanger. So for example, in the first 6-issue arc of my series, let's just talk about that. Now, a 6-issue arc is 6 issues, and that's about 6 months. But the reason that it's important is because that will all be compiled into one slightly bigger volume called a trade paperback. Like one of these. Now, one of these is 6 issues, and you want someone to buy this, but you also want them to buy the individual issues as they're coming out. Now, the way that you're going to make them buy those individual issues every month is the cliffhanger. So think about where you need to place the most important cliffhanger. Obviously, I want to place the most important cliffhanger at the end of my first issue, because if they don't go by the second one, it's all over for me in that regard anyway. They're just not going to be a continued reader. So at the end of the first issue, I put a pretty major cliffhanger, but I also tried to be sure that it fit. It wasn't just there for shock's sake. You never want to do something just for shock value. It also has to tie into the story. And I'm not going to tell you what that cliffhanger is, because it'll be a pretty major spoiler for the story, and I hope that one day you'll be one of those people who's buying issues every month. That would be pretty awesome. But you want to make sure that in the beginning, you're really hooking your readers. And that's why they talk about having a hook at the beginning of your story, but you also want to have a hook at the end of your story. If I watch a first episode of a show and I'm like, that show was okay, maybe I forget to watch the second episode. But if I was like, that episode was pretty good, and then also there's this thing that I'm really curious about, so you know, I'll just watch a bit of episode 2. And then that turns into a binge and I watched the whole season. You really just need to get people onto the second episode, and then things will start moving along a little bit more naturally. If I buy the second issue of a comic book, I'm almost guaranteed to buy the third, just because I already bought the second, so I might as well see where the story goes. What's difficult isn't getting me to buy the first issue, it's getting me to buy the second issue. So keep that in mind when you're deciding where you want to prioritize your big plot twists. Now, issues 2, 3, 4, and 5 will have plot twists and, you know, big scenes and cliffhangers and all of that stuff to keep you engaged. But those will probably be smaller scale cliffhangers, because it's not as momentous of an occasion. I'm not really trying to hook you, I'm just telling you the story. However, issue 6, because it's the end of this trade paperback, we'll probably have another big cliffhanger the way that issue 1 did, because once you've gotten to the end of that trade paperback, I'm trying to convince you to go out and buy another one. Now, it's not all just about money, also about storytelling. The way that I write my comic book, each 6-issue arc is sort of like a small self-contained bit of the story, and then it goes on to the next small self-contained bit of the story. So at the end of the first self-contained bit of the story, the first trade paperback, I will of course need to include a pretty big moment because that's closing out the events of that arc. That's a lot of comic book nonsense, but if you're interested in comic book writing, I have a video linked up above, which is all about how I outline and write my 6-issue arcs. If you're interested, check that out. Comic book writing is pretty cool. It's like getting to hold a little TV show in your hands. Really, all you're missing from a TV show is just camera angles, like panning shots, and music. So that's why I want to learn to write film, because I want a soundtrack. But if you're doing novels, it's pretty much the same thing. You want to keep people engaged the whole way through, and part of that is going to be little cliffhangers and big cliffhangers. So what we can take away from this is to think about where to put little cliffhangers and big cliffhangers. They're not all the same thing. To think about whether they're there for shock value or if they are there for an actual reason. If you reveal that the villain is, I don't know, actually a hero, and that your characters are working for the wrong side the entire time, that's a pretty big cliffhanger. It's a pretty big plot twist, a pretty big moment. I bet you someone will keep reading. However, if that's crucial to your story, if that's where you were planning to go already, do it. If you're only adding that in so that someone buys the next issue or flips the next page, don't do it. Cliffhangers only work if they actually make sense with your story and are actually supposed to be there. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about plot twists, I will link a video up above where I talk all about them and sort of the 5 ways that you can do them right and the 5 ways that people tend to do them wrong. After cliffhangers and plot twists and things like that, which will create a sense of suspense for your writing, we also have withholding information. Now, this is probably my personal favorite way to create suspense. I love withholding information, and I also love stories that withhold information. So for this bit, I'm going to be using the example of Gravity Falls, and I'm going to put a pretty heavy spoiler warning, as in I spoil literally the entire plot of the show. So if you have not seen that show yet, you should probably skip to the next section. I will have timestamps in the description, and they should also appear down in the little bar at the bottom of the screen. But you have been warned. Major spoilers for Gravity Falls ahead. Now, the reason that I wanted to use Gravity Falls as my example for this withholding of information bit is because this show does it so magnificently well. I probably should do a video that is just about what writers can learn from Gravity Falls, because the suspense and plot twists and all that in this show are immensely amazing. But for now, I'm mainly just going to be talking about the subtle foreshadowing that they have throughout the entire show. Now, if you have watched the show, or if you haven't and you decide to stick around despite the spoilers, let me just clarify a couple things. What I'm talking about is the fact that the primary villain of the entire series, Bill, is sprinkled everywhere throughout the show. Everywhere. The plot of the show comes in when Dipper and Mabel discover that all the weird things that their grunkle is showing off in the Mystery Shack are fake. There are actually weird things happening in the small town of Gravity Falls, like gnomes and oh, so many things. You know, gnomes is the first one. Gnomes is a pretty big one. They come back. You gotta love Schmebulok. Anyway, there are weird supernatural things happening here. And the series eventually concludes with the realization that these journals that are a guide to all the supernatural things, but that those are also the key to bringing the multi-dimensional evil into the world, and there's all this stuff. But what the show does really well is it sprinkles in hints that this is coming, and it tells you that it's coming, but it doesn't actually tell you. So let me explain that a little bit. So as soon as our protagonists find one of the journals, we know that there's something greater going on in Gravity Falls, because it talks about how you can't trust anyone. There's weird symbols and designs that we don't understand. And most importantly, there's the number 3 on its cover. Now, this instantly tells us that there is a mystery, because there's 1 and 2 at least coming before this journal. And they will come into play later on in the series, but it's incredibly exciting to get to see that there are journals beyond this one. The 3 is the first step in suspense, and that's introduced pretty much immediately. And then, if you really want to up the suspense, you can add in the withholding of information plus a cliffhanger, which is the fact that the first episode ends with one of the biggest cliffhangers of the entire series, which is Grunkle Stan entering a secret combination into a vending machine. It swings back from the wall and he goes into a secret underground room. That just aced all the plot twists. If you want to know a little bit more about foreshadowing and me talking about Gravity Falls in particular with this, you can check out the videos I will link up above. The first one is what writers can... Oh, this one has such a long name. What writers can learn from Gravity Falls, Star vs. the Forces of Evil, The Owl House, and Amphibia, which is the beginning of this What Writers Can Learn From series that I do on my channel every month, where I break down different videos like that. And then also my Foreshadowing Flashbacks and Visions video, where I talk about foreshadowing flashbacks and visions. So that's more if you want to deep dive. This is the basics. They sprinkle in little signs of what is to come almost constantly, and that continually amps up the suspense. Things like seeing Grunkle Stan go down into the basement that has a secret code to access it. Things like the signs that Bill is related to this house in some way, like the Bill-shaped window, for example. That's a dead giveaway now looking back. The way that Bill wants to take the journal from Dipper later on in the series in the puppet episode, which, fun fact, I'm planning to cosplay Bipper at some point, and my sister said that she's gonna cosplay Gabe. So that's gonna be amazing. I hope she makes the little sock puppets. Anyway, it's just sprinkling in these little things that a perceptive reader will notice. If someone wants to solve a mystery or is curious about something, that's the best way to give them this sense of suspense. That's a great way to make it into a page turner. There's a reason that like mysteries and thrillers and things are page turners. For example, again, in my own comic series, there's something that's sort of like foreshadowed from day one, and I'm not going to tell you what it is because obviously spoilers, but I make sure to sprinkle in little signs that something is going on, and some of them are meant to only be viewed in hindsight, and some of them are meant to build that feeling of suspense. So again, there's two different things. So try and divide your foreshadowing into two different categories, which is which ones you want readers to only notice in hindsight and which ones you want them to notice now. And give them some credit though. Some people will notice things that you meant for them to notice in hindsight now, and it's okay if they can like decipher it a little bit more, because, you know, you're rewarding them for being perceptive. Now, third on our list is to add a ticking clock. This is pretty self-explanatory, so I won't go into too much detail, but think about the Mission Impossible franchise if you've seen those movies. And also let me know in the comments below if I should make a What Writers Can Learn from Mission Impossible. But these movies almost always have a deadline or a ticking clock involved in them. A lot of those more like spy, thriller sort of stories, action movies do. And it works because when we see the time counting down to something that we know is inevitable and bad for our protagonists, we're instantly gonna lean in and be like, can they do it? Can they do it? Even if we know they're gonna do it, we're still a little bit fooled by the ticking clock, and we're like, how will they do it? And that's another thing to think about. If you give them an impossible task, readers will be looking forward to figuring out how they do it. Six of Crows is a great example because it's a heist story. So you know what the characters are going to do. You know because it is a book about this thing that they will end up doing it, but how? And even though I knew that they would somehow succeed in Mission Impossible or in Six of Crows or in Avengers Endgame or whatever it is, I was still totally invested because I wanted to see how. I was invested and in suspense because I knew that this ticking clock was looming over them. I knew that time was running out and that they had this impossible task to accomplish. And I knew that they would do it, but I was so curious to see how the writers had come up with them being able to do it. And in every single one of these scenarios, I was rewarded with a pretty cool movie or book. Now, number 4, the final tip for how to make suspense in your story is to put your characters in increasingly dangerous and difficult situations. This is similar to the last one in the fact that a lot of these stories, like Mission Impossible, do exactly that. Think about it. If your readers get super invested in a character, and then you put them in a situation, you take them out of their safety, and you put them in a situation where they're in a lot of danger, instantly your readers are on the edge of their seat. Especially if you're telling a story where it feels like something could actually happen to them. Like, I recently read Gideon the Ninth. I fell in love with Gideon, and a lot of the characters in that story. It's just an amazing book. But in the beginning of the story, I was just sort of like chill reading, like this book, and then towards like the end when all the stuff was coming into play and big things were happening, I was glued to that book. Like, I think I read like the final third of that entire book in about a day or two, just because I needed to know what happened. I was so scared for these characters that I had come to really care about, and I felt that they were in danger, and they were in danger. So this is another thing that I use in my comic book. I don't really have a ticking clock in my comic book, but I do have this sort of sense of danger. I really wanted to establish early on that things can happen to these characters, and that actions have consequences. And so when a character ends up in danger, your readers aren't going to just feel like, oh, they'll be fine. They're going to lean in. They're going to be in suspense, and they're going to need to know what happens next. They're going to need to see that next episode or need to flip that next page. You can also accomplish this by showing the villain's side of it. I personally love dual point of view stories where you get to see both the heroes and the villain side of a story. You can check out my How to Write Villains playlist up above, where I have a ton of videos all about villains because I love them to bits. But for the sake of this, I won't be telling you how to write a villain. I'll just be giving you a pointer, which is that if you show the villain's side of the story, you'll be building suspense automatically. Because let's say that your heroes are doing something mundane, but then you cut to your villain preparing for something. Automatically, your readers know something that your heroes don't. So when they go back to the hero's point of view doing something mundane, there will still be suspense because they're waiting for that moment when the villain will break through and enact their plan. So by having both point of views, you can build up your villain's side and the suspense without having to have every single scene that the heroes are doing be action-packed and full of suspense on its own. You can use the villain's side to bring suspense to when the heroes are doing something more casual or just licking their wounds after the battle. If you did stick with me to the very end, comment a bee emoji or like a honey emoji for these little bees in my ears. Funny story, because you stuck around to the end, here's a funny bee ear related story. One time when I was little, I had long hair, and a bee got stuck in it, right behind my ear, like here. And my mother was convinced that it was just like a ladybug or there was nothing there, but I was adamant, even though she couldn't see it, was like, there is a bee and it is in my hair. And finally, we were able to actually find the thing. And somehow, my mom untangled it from my hair and it flew away. And it didn't sting me, and it didn't sting her, and it was totally fine. But for a little while there, I was wearing a bee on my ear. So now I'm doing it again. Anyway, there will be videos up on the screen that you should click on if you want to continue your writing journey, I suppose. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next page. Till then.